All right, types of biomes. These are the different types of biomes. I think you should have 10 here. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What I would recommend is pausing it, taking a picture of this, because then we're going to go through individual pictures, and with the pictures I think it might be a good idea to write down the rainfall, the climate, and the vegetation for each of the biomes so that you can kind of keep them side by side. And I think it might make it a little bit easier to understand the differences between some of these. Okay, so let's start. So the world is broken up into 10 climate zones, more or less. You can see here there's some that have been added, like polar ice, that we don't necessarily have if you go back to here. And so there are going to be some climate zones on here that we don't necessarily talk about today. If you can kind of see, we are a little bit in this purple-ish range, maybe the red range. I think we're kind of somewhere in between it, where it's a temperate grassland and a temperate deciduous forest. And so Texas kind of falls, if you've ever gone, which I'm sure you have, from East Texas to Dallas, you can see that the trees start to go away pretty quickly, becomes very flat, and if it weren't for Dallas, there would be evidence of a grassland, which would be kind of similar to what we see north of Dallas, south of Dallas, in Oklahoma, if you will. And so aside from man-made structures, these climates are kind of hidden. You have to think about them outside the cities, maybe. You can see that there are some common things, like across the equator, which is there in red. We tend to have this green, which is common, and this is going to be your tropical rainforest. So it's where most of our rainforests are found. Up in the top of North America and Asia-ish, Europe, all the way to Asia, that big blue one, it's a taiga. And so you'll see there are some common things, but then there are places that are very diverse, like Australia has a little bit of everything, very diverse climates in Australia. All right, so a temperate deciduous forest. Approximately, they get about 75 to 100 centimeters of rain, which is converted to 30 to 40 inches of rain, so that's about 3 to 4 feet of water rainfall a year. They probably get most of it, I would say, during the spring, if you think about us here. Precipitation is year-round, however. Cold weather for a significant portion of the year, and large trees that lose leaves. And so this is something similar. You can see there's lots of water, lots of green plants, and then in the fall and into winter they would lose their leaves, and then they would grow back in the spring. So temperate kind of means mild. Deciduous tells us something about the type of trees, and then it's a forest, which suggests trees. The next type of climate we're going to talk about is temperate grassland or prairies. So you see very flat. This almost makes me think of Kansas, Nebraska, Montana, which is pretty typical type of environment up there. They get a little bit less rain, 10 to 30 inches of rain a year, so that's a little less than a foot, up to maybe 2.5 feet of rain. The climate is very temperate, very mild, not exactly hot or cold. It's considered about average. There are mostly only grasses, but trees will grow along streams, but because they don't have lots of water like we do here in East Texas, there's not going to be trees growing everywhere just because the water is not there. They're going to be located around the consistent water sources like streams. So this reminds me a lot of Lubbock. It's where I went to undergrad my last 2 years. Very flat, no trees. The only trees were on campus for the most part, and people would plant them around their houses as wind blocks. But other than that, not a lot of trees, which was interesting for me. You can see for miles and miles. So we used to joke that in Lubbock you could watch your dog run away for 2 miles, which is probably not wrong. The third climate is called the savanna. So they're going to get approximately 40 inches of rain a year. Now, most of the time that rain is going to fall during what's called a rainy season. So it's going to rain about 3.5 feet, but then it's going to dry out and they're not going to get rain for a long time. So because of this, there's going to be some grasses and some scattered trees, but the trees that they're going to have are more like shrubs, scrubby, brushy trees. I would not call them trees like we have here in East Texas. They're just really hardy trees that don't need a lot of rain because they have to be able to store it in their roots to be able to survive through the dry season. So this savanna would be things that we could imagine lions like to live in. The Lion King is a great example of the savanna. And so while there is rain, and quite a bit of it all falls during the rainy season. So if you've ever seen the Jungle Book movie, the real life one, that becomes an issue, I think, in the Jungle Book movie because the water, they receive lots of it, but then it starts to dry up, and there's a local watering hole that brings all the animals together. And so that's kind of an example of what a savanna might be like. A desert. As you can imagine, we associate deserts with very little to no rainfall, so they get less than 10 inches, or on average about 10 inches during a year. Irregular or low rainfall. Temperatures can be hot or cold, so you can have a cold desert or hot desert. In fact, if you've ever lived in Arizona or been to Arizona, it does get quite chilly there at night, surprisingly cold, but then it's very hot during the day. So things like in Phoenix, I had a friend in grad school who moved there when her husband was stationed in the Air Force, and she would need a sweater at night, but then during the day it was like 110 degrees. And so very big temperature swings, kind of like a week of weather in Texas, but they have it all in one day. They have scattered thorny plants that lack large leaves. So these are things like cactuses. They don't have grass like what we think of as grass. In fact, most of the places in the desert, they'll have like rock yards instead of grass in their yards. Because to get the grass to grow, you have to use a lot of water. And places that are in the desert don't have a natural resource of water year-round. Therefore, it doesn't make sense economically to grow grass. To keep it growing year-round. All right. So the boreal coniferous forest, I always have to put the emphasis on the right word, coniferous forest. So this is very similar in rainfall to the temperate grassland. They get about 10 to 40 inches of rain a year, which is about 1 foot to 3.5 feet. Short, cool, humid summers, so very mild summer compared to what we get, long, cold winters, and abundant snowfall. So these would be places like Canada, Washington, Oregon. I'm trying to think of the states right now. The upper part of California maybe. Where they have coniferous trees, which are green trees like we have here in East Texas. They stay green year-round. Deciduous trees will drop their leaves, and so if you remember back, the word deciduous are trees who drop their leaves. Conifers stay green year-round. They have a very mild summer, but it's humid, a lot of moisture in the air, but then they'll have long, cold winters, typically with lots of snowfall. And then they are associated with very green areas like this, which is the evergreen conifer trees. And then lots of water available, which is necessary for those conifers to grow and survive. All right. Mediterranean shrublands are called chaparral, which when I was in school, there was when I was younger, there was a skating place called Chaparral Ice in Austin. So every time I think of this, I think of ice skating. But a Mediterranean shrubland is going to get about 15 to 40 inches of rain. So that's kind of like the middle. It's very similar to what we just talked about, the coniferous forests. They're going to have wet, cool winters and hot, dry summers. So associated with not a lot of rain in the summer and lots of rain, cool weather in the winter, but not necessarily snow, if you will. And then because of the lack of precipitation during this summer, the majority of their vegetation that you're going to see is going to be kind of like shrubs, things that can exist with very little water during those long, hot, dry summer months. Okay? All right. temperate rainforest. I think these temperate rainforests are really pretty. Just the pictures of them. So temperate rainforest, anytime you think of the word rainforest, you need to think lots of rain. They're going to get about 80 inches or more of rain on average, so that's about 7 feet of rain a year, which is a lot. Their climate's very temperate, kind of mild. They do get rain and or snow. They're going to have, the vegetation is evergreen, conifers, deciduous trees, so those that lose their leaves. Because of the amount of rainfall, they're going to have lots of moss, ferns, and the plant growth is going to be a lot. So very tall trees, lots of overgrowth, kind of looks like a mystical place where fairies might be living, or Sasquatch. I'm not sure which I like better. All right, tundra. Tundra, going to get very little rain, about less than a foot a year. Short, cool summers, but very long, severe winters with what's called permafrost, which is kind of where the ground will ice over. And because it ices over, there's not going to be a lot of vegetation that can survive that permafrost. If you've ever seen Zootopia, they talk about the tundra. Okay, so kind of similar to that. Most of their vegetation is all going to be shrubs, moss, occasional flowering plants, but no trees at all, because trees do not enjoy the permafrost that would exist during that severe winter. Okay, so really pretty site right here. All right, tropical rainforest. It's going to be a place that gets a ton of rain, about 80 inches a year. The temperature is very warm, constant, and it probably rains daily. Don't have much of a winter to speak of. The biodiversity here is a huge range, very dense forest, and little sunlight on the forest floor because of the fact that there is such dense vegetation growing up high. And so there's a tropical rainforest right there. All right, tropical dry forest. Even though it says dry, these places can receive up to 80 inches of rain, but as little as, that math does not make sense. So when you go back up here, it says 230 to 80 inches, but there's no way that can be right. That's interesting math. That should be about 20 inches to 30 inches. So not a lot at all. Okay, tropical dry forest. So they're not as much rain as a typical rainforest. They're going to have seasonal rainfall, monsoon climate in which several months of heavy rainfall are followed by extensive periods without rain. So monsoons are just heavy downpours, kind of like Forrest Gump when they're sitting out in the jungle and it just rains, and then one day it all lets up. That's an example of a tropical dry forest. The trees that they have will drop their leaves during the dry months and then regrow back whenever there is rainfall. Okay, so now we're going to take a break and give you a chance to rest, and then we're going to finish up the last few slides for this chapter.